What would you do if someone called the cops on your own police department, at your own housewarming party? This isn't just a story about an HOA gone wild. It's about a neighborhood queenpin who thought she could out-police the actual police, and the captain who decided to teach her what real authority looks like. It starts with a barbecue, but ends with investigations, lawsuits, and a reckoning that no one saw coming. Stick around. Because if you've ever dealt with someone who abuses rules to control others, you won't want to miss what happens next. The lesson in this story: never underestimate what quiet people are capable of when you push them too far. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. Jake Morales wasn't just any homeowner. He was a precinct captain, a man who'd served over 2 decades keeping peace in one of the busiest districts in the state. When he and his wife Lena moved into Ashford Hills, they expected tranquility. They bought a cozy home on a quiet street with hopes of finally escaping the noise of city life. But they didn't expect Karen. Karen Wilkins, the HOA president, introduced herself within hours of their moving truck arriving. She came with a clipboard, a printed rule book, and a warning about mailbox height. The next week it was the welcome mat, then string lights, and then came a flyer about unregistered landscape aesthetics. Jake assumed she'd lose interest once she realized who he was. She didn't. Karen believed she was the law, and when Jake and Lena hosted a small backyard cookout for a few off-duty officers and close friends, Karen decided to make a call, not to them, to 911. 2 squad cars rolled up mid-meal, sirens, lights, neighbors staring. Officers stepped out with serious intent, hands near holsters, the kind of arrival meant for a drug raid, not burgers and lemonade. The irony? Most of the guests were Jake's own team. Real officers, real credentials. One of them still had her badge clipped to her jeans. But the rookies responding didn't know that. The 911 report said armed impersonators and possible gang activity. Jake calmly approached, held up his badge. "Captain Morales, this is my home, these are my officers." That ended the confusion. For the cops. Across the street, Karen stood on her lawn, wine in hand, nodding smugly like she'd just averted a crisis. She hadn't. She'd created one. Her phone call wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a false report. She weaponized emergency services over a personal annoyance. And she didn't seem to grasp the danger of what she'd done. In that moment, Jake realized something chilling. This wasn't an entitled neighbor overstepping her bounds. This was someone playing God with other people's safety. Had the responding officers not hesitated, things could have gone tragically wrong. For him, for his guests, for a kid chasing a ball near the fence. And Karen? She was still sipping Chardonnay, blissfully unaware that she had just lit the fuse on her own downfall. Jake didn't argue with the cops. He didn't yell. He smiled politely, walked back into his yard, and told his guests to relax. Then he turned to Lena and said quietly, "She has no idea what she just started." What Karen didn't know was that Jake had a long memory, a deep network, and a very thorough understanding of both the law and how to use it. That night, he started gathering evidence, call transcripts, photos, witness names. He pulled security footage, took screenshots of Karen's online posts, and he didn't do it in anger. He did it with precision, because this wasn't going to be solved with a warning letter or a passive-aggressive note. Karen had crossed a line. She had filed a false police report, she had endangered civilians, and now she was going to learn what happens when the person you try to intimidate is the one writing the incident report. The next morning, Jake's phone buzzed with a message from one of his rookies. "Captain, are we in trouble for last night?" He smiled. "No, but someone else is." Across the street, Karen was already crafting her next HOA bulletin. She had no idea the complaint she filed had triggered a formal misconduct inquiry, no idea that her name was already being discussed by legal advisors, no clue that her little power game had finally reached someone who wouldn't play along. This wasn't about one bad party call anymore. This was about setting things right in a neighborhood held hostage by a petty dictator with a printer. Jake looked at the printed HOA rules Karen had left in his mailbox and smiled. He'd read them all. Twice. And he was about to use every single one against her. Because when you come for a cop in his own backyard, you better be ready for what comes next. The morning after the sirens faded and the burgers went cold, Karen struck again, digitally this time. By 7 a.m., the neighborhood HOA forum lit up with a post titled, "Suspicious Activity Confirmed at 84 Stonebridge. Community Alert." Beneath it, she wrote a full report in bold Arial font, like she was briefing Homeland Security. She described Jake's party as an unauthorized tactical assembly, claimed residents were intimidated by the presence of armed impersonators, and urged the board to take immediate action against what she called blatant community code violations. She didn't use Jake's name, of course. Just vague language, hoping implication would do the damage, but the subtext wasn't subtle, and the timing? Clear as sirens. Karen wanted control back, and she was trying to do it the only way she knew how, through veiled threats and neighborhood hysteria. Jake saw the post over morning coffee and didn't even blink. He just said, "She really thinks she's still winning." Lena looked up from her laptop, smirking. Let her think it. What started on the HOA forum spread to the neighborhood Facebook group like wildfire. Karen posted in 3 different threads, concerned about increasing gatherings with unknown badges. Safety starts with awareness. Remember, silence is complicity. She sprinkled in grainy, zoomed-in photos of the party from across the street. You could barely tell if the people were even holding burgers or badges. But that didn't matter. Karen was writing her own narrative, and in that version, she was a neighborhood watchdog, and Jake was a possible instigator of unsafe community behavior. Jake read through every comment, silently cataloging usernames. Some neighbors asked for clarification, others laughed it off, but a few, Karen's inner circle echoed concern. It was classic keyboard courage. Type first, think never. The kicker? Karen even ran a poll asking whether the community should vote on uniformed gatherings. 5 people voted yes. 2 were probably sock puppet accounts. Lena leaned over, scrolled through it all, and said, "You know she thinks she's the protagonist, right?" Jake didn't laugh. "Let's make sure she finds out she's not." By midweek, Jake pulled a full public records request on Karen's 911 history. The document was 17 pages long, 34 emergency calls in 12 months, most dismissed, some barely investigated. One time, she called in a noise complaint because a neighbor's teenager was playing acoustic guitar with violent rhythms. Another time, she reported a vehicle suspiciously parked, which turned out to be an Amazon delivery truck, stopped for 8 minutes. Jake highlighted every entry. Most of the suspects were teens, delivery drivers, or people of color walking their dogs. The same Karen who claimed to be protecting the neighborhood was weaponizing fear like it was a sport. The worst part? No one had ever called her out for it, until now. "This isn't just petty anymore," Jake said. "It's dangerous." Lena nodded. She's one bad assumption away from someone getting hurt. Jake leaned back, eyes narrowing. "And I'm going to make sure that assumption never happens again." 2 days later, Jake got his first official warning delivered via HOA letterhead and slipped into his mailbox. Citation Code 4D, Unauthorized Backyard Assembly involving municipal uniforms. Secondary violation, visual disruption due to overcrowding and visible law enforcement branding. Fine, pending HOA review. Jake read it once, then twice. "Did she just fine me for having police officers at my house?" he asked Lena. Lena took the paper, squinted, then burst out laughing. "What the hell is Code 4D? Jake pointed at the header. She made her own code system. "She's building her own legal universe," Lena said. "Some people write fan fiction. Karen writes fake citations." Jake pulled out a folder labeled Receipts. Inside were HOA bylaws, all real ones. Not a single one prohibited uniformed officers at private events. But the letter made one thing crystal clear. Karen wasn't stopping. She was trying to manufacture legitimacy, one made-up violation at a time. Jake was ready to blow. But Lena, she was a different kind of weapon. "Let her keep firing blanks," she said, flipping through the rule book like it was a puzzle. "All we have to do is collect everything. The contradictions, the violations, the patterns, and then we show her what facts feel like." Jake paused. "So we don't push back?" "Oh, we push," she said, "but we don't shove. We outsmart. Because when you've spent your life dealing with chaos, you don't meet fire with fire. You meet it with strategy, composure, and a paper trail so airtight it turns a tyrant into a cautionary tale." And that's when Jake knew Karen wasn't just out of her depth. She was about to drown in it. Karen wasn't done. She had her clipboard, her faux codes, her fantasy of being suburban law incarnate. But Jake had something better. He had a badge. He had proof. He had Lena. And most of all, he had time. Because justice doesn't always kick down the door. Sometimes it waits in your mailbox, builds a file, and knocks quietly. With a notarized affidavit. Up next, how Karen's obsession triggers a citywide investigation, and the moment her empire begins to crumble. Jake didn't raise his voice, he raised a file. While Karen was busy mailing out fake citations and passive-aggressive flyers, Jake got to work. By the end of the week, he had assembled what he called the Captain's Case File. It was a binder filled with timestamped screenshots, official police logs, audio recordings, HOA bylaws, and the crown jewel, Karen's 911 history. He marked every page with precision: the fake impersonator claim, the string light complaint, the code 4D nonsense she invented on HOA letterhead. One section was dedicated entirely to neighbor testimonies, real stories of harassment that stretched back years. Jake labeled each violation with bright red tabs, like they were crimes in a cold case. "This isn't personal," he said to Lena one evening. "It's procedural." But everyone knew this was personal. Not because she ruined his party, not because she embarrassed him in front of his team, but because she turned safety into a weapon. And someone like that shouldn't be allowed to hold a clipboard, let alone power. Once Jake went public with his investigation, the neighborhood finally exhaled. People who had been silent started stepping forward. One woman said Karen fined her for hanging a wind chime. "Too musical for community standards," the notice read. Another neighbor, recently widowed, recalled how Karen checked his garbage can for unauthorized compost. Then came the real bombshell. Alex from 3 streets over, a civil rights attorney who had his own legal scuffle with Karen after she tried to report his wife's headscarf as non-uniform attire. He met Jake at the park, shook his hand, and said, "I've been waiting for someone with a badge to take her down." Jake shared what he had so far. Alex added legal context to every incident. The false reports, abuse of emergency services. The citations, fraud. The social media slander, defamation. Jake realized something. Karen hadn't just been annoying, she had built a pattern of control masked as policy. And now, the people she'd silenced were lining up with receipts. This wasn't just a captain building a case anymore. This was a community preparing to take back their voice. With Alex officially on board, things moved fast. They drafted a complaint for the city attorney's office, citing 3 primary charges: harassment through false HOA violations, defamation via public statements, misuse of emergency response systems. They backed it all with video footage, logs, and a growing list of sworn statements from residents. It wasn't just about taking Karen down, it was about showing the city how dangerous it could be when someone with no training claims authority. They included the HOA handbook, highlighted with all the areas Karen had modified, added to, or outright fabricated. Alex filed the initial complaint. Jake hand-delivered copies to the HOA board, the city compliance office, and one to Karen's mailbox, marked certified receipt requested. That evening, Jake told Lena, "We're not just fighting fire with fire." She smiled. "We're using fire codes." As expected, Karen didn't retreat, she doubled down. A new notice appeared on Jake's porch the next morning, wrapped in a plastic sleeve with HOA branding. It claimed Jake had violated Article 7B, Incitement of disorderly conduct through unauthorized assembly. Lena read it aloud and laughed so hard she choked on her coffee. Did she just say, "You incited a gathering in your own yard"? Jake didn't respond. He was already scanning the letterhead. It wasn't even current. She had used an outdated HOA template. No barcode, no legal footer, just bold words and a fictional code. And that was the problem with people like Karen. She thought authority came from loud fonts and uppercase letters. She didn't realize the law wore quieter shoes. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Karen sat at the front, fanning herself with her fake rulebook, flanked by her loyal clique, half of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Jake sat in the second row, manila folder on his lap. She began her address like a dictator on a PTA stage. "We are a community of order and safety, and some among us seek to undermine that order." Jake stood up, didn't wait for recognition. "Karen, you don't run a neighborhood, you run a Gasps, a few chuckles, one neighbor clapped before realizing it wasn't polite yet. Jake calmly walked to the front, opened his folder, and laid out his exhibits on the table. Copies of false reports, citations with imaginary codes, screenshots of her own words. She's not enforcing safety, she's manufacturing crisis. Karen turned red. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her rules were made of paper. Jake brought a fire. The audit didn't start with a bang. It started with a paper trail. When the city investigator received the flash drive from Gerald, the former HOA treasurer who finally cracked, it was like handing gasoline to a bonfire. Karen's fraud wasn't subtle. It was practically spray-painted across the spreadsheets. HOA funds meant for community maintenance had been rerouted into a series of special projects that just so happened to all occur at Karen's property. There were charges listed as beautification allowance, outdoor security enhancements, and the infamous community relaxation deck, which, according to photos, was really just Karen's brand new patio, complete with custom tile and mood lighting. Jake watched the inspector's eyebrows rise with every click of the mouse. This is either the worst bookkeeping I've ever seen or the most casual embezzlement in HOA history. Jake smiled and replied, "Why not both?" Within a week, the ripples started hitting shore. One by one, HOA board members resigned or flipped. Some claimed ignorance, we never saw the full records. Others admitted they were pressured. A few even tried to backtrack by providing old emails where Karen aggressively shut down any attempts at oversight. One board member, Patricia, openly cried during a neighborhood meeting and apologized for enabling the chaos. "I just didn't want to get fined for my hummingbird feeder," she whispered, and half the room nodded. The house that Karen built with fines and fear was crumbling, and the people who once stood behind her were now stepping aside, watching the storm they helped create tear itself down. That's when the residents made their move. An emergency HOA vote was scheduled, something rarely done, but fully within their rights once enough signatures were collected. The turnout was massive. Jake hadn't seen this many people in one place since Karen tried to outlaw Halloween decorations for being visually disruptive. Ballots were distributed. The question, should Karen Wilkins be suspended from her role as HOA president pending full investigation and review? The answer was swift, loud, and one-sided. 92% voted in favor. Some clapped, some cheered. One neighbor yelled, "Finally, my wreath can breathe." Karen didn't even show up to the vote. She sent a statement through a friend claiming the process was rigged and politically motivated. But the truth was obvious. Her power was gone, her title stripped, her clipboard rendered legally useless. The next weekend, the neighborhood threw a party. Not just any gathering, but a full-on block party celebration. Balloons, lawn games, grills firing in every driveway. Someone made t-shirts that said, "No more fines for flags," and another neighbor printed out parody HOA citations and handed them out for things like "too much smiling in public" and "unauthorized level of good vibes." Lena set up a lemonade stand and gave out compliance-free cookies. For the first time since they moved in, Jake saw the neighborhood laugh without looking over its shoulder. He raised a soda can with Alex and said, "It only took an audit, a lawsuit, and a 911 incident to get here." Alex replied, "Worth it." But of course, Karen wasn't going out quietly. 2 days later, Jake received a certified envelope from a law firm no one had ever heard of. Karen was suing for emotional distress, defamation, and disruption of neighborhood harmony. The letter claimed Jake had created a hostile suburban takeover and undermined the social structure of Ashford Hills. Jake handed the letter to Alex, who read it once, blinked twice, and said, "This reads like a screenplay for a bad courtroom drama." Within a week, the firm dropped the case. Whether Karen couldn't pay or the lawyers realized their client was a human PR disaster, the suit vanished without a trace. Jake's official response was short. "You're not being silenced, Karen. You're being heard and disproven." This part of the story gave the audience something satisfying, a real taste of justice served not through shouting or vengeance, but with unity, intelligence, and dry paper turned into power. It reminds us that tyranny only works when people stay quiet, that one clipboard doesn't stand a chance against a community with receipts and resolve. The neighborhood didn't just remove a leader, they reclaimed their peace. And in doing so, they reminded everyone watching that sometimes the most powerful thing you can bring to a fight is the truth, written down, signed by your neighbors, and read aloud with no fear. The gloves were off, and this time it wasn't about porch signs or party noise, it was legal. Jake filed formal claims with the city and the county, one for defamation, one for public nuisance, one for HOA procedural fraud, and it stuck because with the audit, the abuse records, and the mountains of neighbor-backed evidence, Karen's so-called authority was now nothing more than a title on a soon-to-be forgotten plaque. The city flagged her HOA bylaws as non-compliant, unenforceable, and in some cases, flat-out fabricated. In legal terms, they called it a systemic overreach. In common sense terms, Jake called it what it was: power gone to a clipboard. In court, the truth hit like a sledgehammer. Neighbors came forward in droves. The woman who was fined for sidewalk chalk, the veteran who'd been forced to remove his American flag for being too bold, the family who got a warning letter because their wind chimes were audible during daylight hours. One soft-spoken man stood up and said, "She tried to evict me for having too many plants." The courtroom stared. Even the judge paused to raise an eyebrow. Then came the kicker: Jake's video compilation, HOA patrols harassing joggers, Karen inspecting recycling bins like she was a forensic analyst. One clip showed her holding up a protractor to someone's lawn gnome. That's when the gallery started laughing. And the judge didn't stop them. The verdict came down swift and clean. Karen was stripped of all HOA privileges, barred from holding any neighborhood leadership position for 10 years. She was ordered to pay restitution for misused HOA funds, issue a written apology to every resident she had fined without cause, and attend a community leadership ethics course. Jake didn't celebrate in court. He didn't gloat. He just nodded, because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't need applause. It speaks for itself. Karen tried to interject with one last point of order, but the judge cut her off. "This court respects order," he said, "not delusion." Back in Ashford Hills, change swept in like a cool breeze. The new HOA board, made up of residents who had lived quietly under Karen's shadow for too long, introduced a full transparency policy. No more secret votes. No more fake bylaws. No more HOA security teams unless formally approved by the city. Lawn signs were allowed again. Porch decor, too. One woman put up an inflatable flamingo just to test the limit. The board applauded her initiative. Meetings became community forums, not lectures. Trust started to grow again. In the middle of it all, Jake was approached with a clipboard, not Karen's, but Marlene's, the interim president. She asked if he'd consider joining the new board, maybe even lead it. He smiled and shook his head. "I appreciate it," he said, "but peace doesn't need a badge." He didn't want control, he just wanted quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't come with sirens or citations. And truth be told, Lena had already made her opinion clear. "Let the cat sweater crew run the show," she said. "You've done enough for one lifetime." But this wasn't the final chapter. Not yet. Because just when the neighborhood exhaled, just when peace had returned like an old friend, you guessed it, Karen wasn't quite done. Not yet. It was barely a whisper against the door, a knock, hesitant but loaded with the same self-importance that had haunted Ashford Hills for far too long. Jake opened it slowly, and there it was. A certified letter, no return address, but the envelope was thick. And the font? Oh, unmistakable. Karen had returned. Not in person, of course. That would have required facing people without hiding behind policy. Instead, she sent legal paperwork accusing Jake of emotional coercion, character defamation, and yes, community destabilization. She really used that phrase. Alex, the civil rights lawyer, took one look at the letter and said, "She's still writing HOA fan fiction." They filed it straight under frivolous, and the court tossed it within 48 hours. No hearing, no traction, just one last gasp that barely registered a ripple. 2 weeks later, the for sale sign that had long stood like a white flag in Karen's front yard was finally gone. In its place, a moving van, a station wagon, and laughter, real, easy laughter. The new owners were a young couple with a toddler and a rescue dog that barked at everything but still wagged its tail. They brought zucchini bread to every neighbor on their row, waved at kids riding scooters, and installed a wind chime that sang like freedom every time the breeze blew. The woman even asked Jake if the HOA was still a thing. He grinned and said, "It used to be a regime, now it's more like a suggestion box." Watching her smile, he knew the chapter had truly closed. The dictatorship was gone and something better had taken root. But then came a package. No sender, just a plain cardboard box left on Jake's porch, taped neatly, no signature. He opened it cautiously and found a handcrafted shadow box. Inside, a miniature police badge, a plastic flamingo with shades on, and a sticker that read, "Ashford's Real Sheriff." Below it was a folded card, "For the barbecue that launched a revolution. Thanks for standing your ground." No signature again, but Jake had his guesses. Maybe it was Manny, maybe Tina, maybe the entire neighborhood had quietly chipped in. Either way, it was perfect. He hung it on the wall next to the old HOA citation Karen once mailed about unauthorized porch gatherings. One represented fear, the other, pride, humor, home. Life post-Karen wasn't loud. It was light, peaceful. Porch lights stayed on late. Kids decorated sidewalks with chalk dragons and hopscotch maps. Someone put up fairy lights in their bushes, and not a single complaint was filed. Jazz music played on weekends, dogs roamed the yard, and laughter didn't need to hide behind curtains anymore. HOA meetings still happened, but now they felt more like potlucks than tribunals. Marlene led with warmth and cookies, bylaws were discussed, not weaponized, and every time someone brought up a rule suggestion, someone else would ask, "Would Karen have liked this?" And if the answer was yes, the rule died on the spot. One quiet evening, Jake sat on the porch with Lena, lemonade in hand, the street bathed in golden light. She leaned her head on his shoulder and asked, "You ever think it would end like this?" He smiled, eyes scanning the peaceful homes, the soft hum of life. "Not like this," he said. "Better." Across the street, a kid with a water gun declared a neighborhood-wide water war. Parents laughed, sprinklers came on, and Jake just watched, feeling the weight of months finally lift. "No fines," he said, "just friends." Where Karen built walls of fear, they had planted roots of trust. And in the soil of rebellion, community had bloomed. Real, grounded, good. The kind of ending that doesn't need a bang, just a breeze, a porch swing, and neighbors who smile when they wave. Because sometimes the strongest justice isn't in courtrooms or citations. It's in living well, together. Let's talk about what Jake did right, and what you can do if you ever find yourself face to face with your very own HOA tyrant. First, Jake didn't react with rage. He reacted with receipts. He documented everything, from video footage and 911 transcripts to screenshots and signed neighbor statements. Jake built a case the way a detective builds a file, with patience, precision, and undeniable proof. He didn't let Karen's noise drown out the truth. Instead, he made the truth loud enough to echo through a courtroom. Second, he didn't isolate. He organized. He brought his neighbors together, empowered the quiet ones, and gave a voice to people who had been bullied into silence. In the end, it wasn't one man who brought down Karen. It was a community that remembered how to stand. So how do you handle an overreaching HOA or a Karen with a clipboard and too much confidence? Start with your local laws. Every HOA must operate within state statutes. Know your homeowner rights, request meeting minutes, check where your dues go, keep a paper trail. If you get an unfair citation, respond in writing, save every email, take photos, record conversations if your state allows it, and never, ever fight fire with fire. Fight fiction with facts. And if things get really bad, contact your city attorney, local civil rights advocates, or housing regulators. People like Karen count on your silence. Break it. There's something powerful about community, real community. Not the kind that hides behind bylaws and yard measurements, but the kind that shares stories, builds trust, and protects its own. The moment Jake shared his experience, others stepped forward. Each voice added weight to the truth. Each story chipped away at the fear. That's how bullies lose their grip. Not with a lawsuit or a punchline, but with people refusing to be pushed around. When one neighbor speaks up, others realize they're not alone, and that's when the tide turns. So here's the truth you came for. You don't need a badge to stand tall. You don't need rank or title or training. You just need a spine, a strategy, and the will to say, this isn't right. Because every clipboard tyrant eventually runs out of paper. But a good neighbor outlasts them, every time. If you've ever dealt with an HOA horror story, or wish you had a Jake on your block, hit that like button. Drop your story in the comments. And subscribe so you don't miss the next tale of neighborhood justice. Because somewhere out there another Karen is plotting, and someone else needs to hear what standing up can look like. This is for them, and for you.